So this is the second month in the project. The first month we had a seminar with Maitra Bandhu and Jnana Vacha on this subject of kind of divided brain, which is an Ian McGilchrist subject. He wrote a book called Master and His Emissary, and very, very interesting man, very, very interesting, I think it's a theory still, about having two hemispheres of the brain, where one collects all the information, passes it across to the other side, the left brain, which usually works in a form of thinking, using logic, language, and thinking in a kind of linear way. And but the right brain is quite capable of thinking. It can think more metaphorically, using poetry, stories, and so on. And most of us nowadays tend to think in this more left brain way, using logic, as I say, logic, using language, and thinking, in a sort of one thing happens after another, like in time. And McGilchrist is concerned that the human race is becoming too one-sided in this way. So it's he had something to say about mind, and it's quite useful just reflecting, how your mind works. Are you always thinking about things in that way, or do you tend to think in some other way? I know some people can think in visually. My mind certainly thinks logically, and sometimes I wish I could just switch it off. Anyway, I'll say more about that in a moment. And then on Friday evening, we had a seminar with Maitra Bandhu and Jnana Vacha, talking about Penny Sartori's book, an interview on near-death experiences. And so this seems to be becoming an increasingly popular area for many people in life. And I kind of suspect it's because death is one of those things one of those issues in life where we don't find it easy to go towards. It's as though, well, certainly when we're young, we don't even think it's going to happen for a long time. And as you get older, you're forced almost to start thinking about it a bit more. And I think it's a way of leaning into the subject instead of kind of trying to confront death straight on. Looking at near-death experiences is a very, very interesting way of coming closer to the issue of death. Of course, many of us are frightened of death. We don't know what's going to happen afterwards. But I found the interviews with Penny Sartori very, very encouraging, because it seems to suggest, almost with a certain amount of evidence, if you could call it that, so many people have had near-death experiences. It seems to suggest that what we call consciousness or mind doesn't just end with death, that it continues in some form or another after death. Or maybe it doesn't continue in a form at all. So this is where we get into Buddhist metaphysics, and I'll try to avoid that. Just by the way, I've no idea how many new people there are have joined us on this course. And in a way, this is a kind of a outreach course. It's trying to attract more and more people to discover, to work with their mind, take an interest in mind. So I'd like to give a particular warm welcome to all of you if you're new, and particularly if this is the first time you're on one of these events. I'm just going to say a little bit about my own experience of mind by way of introduction. I had a rather strange experience when I was about 6 or 7. It was as I was put in bed by my parents, and I was lying there, and I suddenly realized I was awake. I was awake. I realised I was lying between sheets in a bed in London, and it was as though my brain just started working, and I started asking myself, how did I get here? I don't know why I asked that question, but the whole experience was odd. It was just like waking up, and I started thinking. And nowadays, I think I must have been using a very left brain approach to my thinking, because I asked the question, how did I get there? And then I went back and back and back. I went through my parents, my grandparents, their grandparents, right back to the first people. And then I thought, well, how did the first people get to be here? And then I assumed, well, this word God, this being that I'd heard about, had created them. And most people stopped there, but my brain didn't. It wanted to know who created God. I just assumed that if there was a God, something must have, or somehow or another, it began. And around about this point, I started realizing there was a problem, that no matter how far you went back, there was always a point beyond that. And nowadays, I realize it's what's called an infinite regress. You don't actually get an answer, but it actually terrified me. I completely terrified that the world could not have begun, because there could never be a before the beginning. See, and things just can't come from nothing. So I wasn't so much interested in the end of things, at the end of life and death. I was terrified about the beginning of things, and I did find death a bit frightening, because I thought that's when I would understand that it was all wrong. I somehow felt that the reality that I had around me, really wasn't really real. And anyway, I mainly had to deal with fear for the next few years. And when I was 13, in a maths lesson of all places, I was doing some project with hyperbolic functions and things, and you have these curves on hyperbolic curves and parabolia curves. I can't remember what they're called now, but I worked out that only part of a curve is a practical use for people, like on the x-y axis, and that the curve continued off to infinity but never reached its maximum. And what was interesting about this is that it was a kind of metaphor for me for mind. I realized that you could only think about certain things with the mind that we had, and there were certain things that you couldn't think about because there was no way of thinking about them. So I came to terms with the fact that I had a mind that was very limited, and but I also had a sense that there might be another faculty, another way of being that would allow me to deal with this issue that I had as a small child. So that was very, very reassuring. I thought, oh, well, I just have to live my life within this kind of box of parameters that I couldn't think about things outside of. I couldn't think of how big the universe was. That was outside the parameters of this box of mind. And I came to terms with that. So I became aware I had a mind. And later, when I was about 18, in a kind of dream or vision I had, a figure that I now identify with, a Buddhist figure called Kui Ning. No, not Kui Ning, Avalokiteshvara in the Chinese form, sort of appeared to me and, well, to cut a long story short, basically told me the meaning of life was just to keep going. It didn't really matter where you come from or where you were trying to get to. It was the act of going that was really important. Actually, the act of living life was the really important thing. So for some reason, this was incredibly reassuring too. And shortly after this, I happened to discover Buddhism and found that the Buddha said something very, very similar, that with our present mind, there are certain questions we can't really ask even, can't even find an answer to. But the most important thing is to deal with what the issues that we have in life. So that was my experience of mind. I could also say that my mother was a spiritualist. So a lot of the things that Penny Sartori talked about in her interview and was mentioned briefly by Mitra Bandhu and Yanavacha on Friday, I was quite familiar with. And I also remember when I went to live in Stockholm for a while, and my teacher, Sangraksha, he gave me a book on Emanuel Swedenborg, who also had an experience of watching people. Peculiarly, at the end of his garden in Stockholm, he used to watch them cross over, and he realized that they were people leaving this life, crossing over into another life. So this whole idea of a journey and getting to a point and then crossing over, I was quite familiar with from my mother, from her spiritualist leanings, and then again later from Swedenborg, who I found very, very interesting. See, he used to be an engineer as well, which is my own background. So yeah, I found all that very, very interesting. So we have a mind, and it seems as though we use this term mind quite freely. It's actually, in English, the word is one of those words that means all sorts of things, isn't it? We say you can mind your own business, you can say it's on your mind, and we kind of identify mind as a thing that we have. But if you start exploring it, it becomes more and more complex. The very first seminar, a Buddhist seminar I attended, was one that dealt with mind. It was called Outlines of Mahayana Buddhism. And I came from an engineering background, so I hardly knew what some of the words meant in this text, and found it all rather confusing. And I remember saying to Sangraksha at the end, I don't really understand how to approach mind. There are just so many different words that you can use, so many different ways, so many different levels, I just find it all a bit confusing. And there was something he said that was kind of seminal really to my own practice. He said, well, maybe the most important thing to do is, if you want to know what mind is, to watch your own mind. So, like, what is mind? You can think about it, you can read about it, you can approach it from all different angles, but in the end, the only thing you can be sure of is if you watch your own mind, watch what's happening in your mind. And so I thought that was interesting. And after learning to practice yoga, I realized when I was lying down at the end of the first yoga session and watching, just being aware of my body, I just suddenly realized that my mind was just thinking the whole time. It was like a radio broadcasting thoughts. I hadn't realized this until I suddenly was lying there and I'm thinking, wow, I'm just thinking the whole time. I can't stop thinking. And there was one thought after another. And so I kind of thought that was interesting. And I was really interested in if I could switch them off and just experience things in a different sort of way. So that's been my practice, I think, for the last 30 or 40 years, is trying to come to terms with the fact that your mind's a bit unruly, it's a bit wild sometimes. It just seems to go wherever it wants to. And no matter how much you train it, you can eventually get it to do certain things that you want to. But basically, it's weird, the mind. It's weird and it's wonderful and it's interesting. And one of the things, I wanted to link this particularly to what Penny talked about, which is pointing us towards the fact that there's death in our lives, and that life begins with birth and it continues and then we die. And we often avoid that subject. Last year I happened to be at a talk that someone gave at a hospice, and the thing they said that really struck me there is that when people are able to confront death, it's as though they can live more freely. It's as though something is released in them. And if you're avoiding death the whole time, if you really do not want to take into account that you're going to die, and so you just avoid it, people don't usually talk about it. We hardly ever see a dead body in the West, in modern industrial cultures. Bodies are taken away quickly. I have seen several dead bodies in my life, and you kind of realize it's normal, but it's just part of nature, that things come into being and then things die. All around us, it happens all the time, particularly if we go out and walk through nature, we see it everywhere. And it's one of those things about life that brings so much fear and grief, particularly when people die, and it's something we have to deal with. But if we could approach life perhaps with a sense that the beginnings and endings is something very, very normal, that it's happening all the time. And I wanted to use these meditations this week to sort of go into this subject of realizing that mind is like an experience, or is a flow of experiences. Is a consciousness, is like a river, if you like, rather than a fixed thing. And that all our experiences are connected with a flow. There's not an experience that's kind of static, that's stuck. We may sometimes feel as though we're stuck in an experience, but if we start to analyze it and watch it carefully, we realize as it changes. I've done a lot of work with people who suffer from chronic pain, and they also report that when you have chronic pain isn't just static, that the pain comes and goes, or sometimes in waves. And I know from my own experiences of having migraines that you can say, I've got a migraine, but actually what you've got is a whole experience of things happening that seem to come and go. And if we can approach life in this way, we probably could experience life being a lot richer, and that we could get a lot more out of life. And one of the things that Penny Sartori discovered in her research, was that a lot of people who had near-death experiences, when they actually had an experience of coming very, very close to death, it was transformative. It transformed people, mostly in a very, very positive way. Really big transformations took place. Not just the way they looked at life and thought, but it actually changed the whole way they lived. They lived their life. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity, really, to contemplate and realize that life is forever changing, which is a bit of a nuisance sometimes, because particularly when we've got it all sorted. If we get those moments where it's all sorted, and it feels like just moved into the new house, it's just right, got the right job, I can get enough money to pay for it if you're rich enough to buy a house, or you just feel this is the right situation. And then a little thought comes into your mind, but it's not going to last very long. Something's going to go wrong, or it does, whatever happens, it's never really static. And we resist it. And when we resist that, we get more problems and difficulties. So if we can learn to experience the constant flow, the constant change that's taking place all the time, I think we find that we can embrace life more fully. We can, as one Tibetan Rinpoche says, we can be in love with life, with all its sort of beauty and difficulties. That we can kind of embrace it much more. And as we do so, this can be transformative in our own life and help us to deal with difficulties, particularly when they arise, and to fully and more deeply enjoy the good things in life when they come along too. So these are my sort of ideas for the meditations, is that we, excuse me, we look at different aspects of our experience and just follow the flow of a changing way of being. And so we're going to meditate. If there's anyone here who's never meditated before, don't worry, you don't have to know how to meditate. I'm just going to lead us through a meditation. If you've meditated before, and I'm sure there's a lot of people here who've meditated for many, many years as well, one of the good things about to remember about meditation is always approach meditation as though you're a complete beginner. Beginner's mind is the meditator's mind. It should be a mind that doesn't know or expect anything to happen. And then, of course, anything can happen. If you've got an expectation what you're going to get from meditation, you'll either just keep reproducing the same thing, or it won't. Nothing will happen in the way you want it to. So if you can approach meditation as like a beginner, if you are an experienced person, and if you are a beginner, just think how lucky you are, because you've got no expectations of what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. But I'll tell you one thing that you will find that happens, whether you're an experienced meditator or not, is that if you sit and try to focus your mind, which is what we're going to do in a moment, on one thing, your mind won't stay still. It will go off somewhere after a while. Now, some people get very, very good at keeping their mind focused on something. You can do this with years of practice, or if you've got the right conditions, if you go on a retreat or something where this is all you're doing, you can get to a place where it's not as though you're not thinking ever, but your mind becomes quite still. But usually your mind, if you think of your mind more like where you're paying what you're paying attention to, what you're interested in, it's going to the things that you find interesting. Now, unfortunately, the things we find interesting aren't always pleasant. We sometimes worry about things, and that becomes our big interest. So that's where our mind goes. So it's good to remember that the mind goes somewhere. So this first meditation this morning, all we're going to do is we're going to use the experience of breathing as a kind of anchor to anchor us in the present moment, just like now, not thinking about the past or thinking about the future, just being where we are now. And we're going to anchor ourselves in our body. So it's a bit like our mind's not gone off somewhere, but we're just here now in our body. And the simplest way to do this, and also it will bring in a kind of an experience of flow, is to be aware of your breathing. You can't really be aware of your breath. You haven't got a breath. What you've got is a process of breathing. It's just going, the air's coming in, the air's going out. You don't have to think about the physiology of it. You can experience that. Everyone can experience it. The breath coming in and going out. If you happen to be a person that doesn't feel comfortable experiencing your breathing, you can experience other parts of your body moving instead of the air moving in and out. You can experience the bits of the body kind of lifting and dropping as you breathe. So you can try to focus your attention there. Sometimes it's called a breathing anchor. I like this term because it's like, when I say a breathing anchor, I always have an image of a boat in a bay, usually a beautiful bay of blue water, with sandy beach around. And I've dropped an anchor off the front of this nice, beautiful yacht that I happen to be owning in my mind, in my fantasy. And the wind is blowing the boat around the anchor. So it's kind of anchored to one place, but it moves around. And so I allow my mind to move around a bit, but coming back and not getting lost, like not going ashore and walking up the rocks or anything, or going for a swim, but just being anchored in that one place. You can do that's a metaphor, of course, for just sticking with your breathing. So that's what we're going to do for about 25 minutes, half an hour. And I'll just talk you through it and give you some pointers, because you may find that you've just drifted off and you've gone somewhere else instead of being anchored to the boat, anchored to the practice. So what's very helpful is if you can find a posture that you can sit in without moving for 25 minutes, half an hour. It may not be fully comfortable. Ideally, it's a posture that makes you feel alert. So if you're leaning back and or even lying down, the danger is you'll fall asleep, which you're okay. I mean, some of the things may happen. If you're particularly tired, you might need to sit up a little bit more. And ideally, you want to let the body relax. If you're sitting on a straight chair, you can make sure that you've got some support, perhaps a bit higher up your back, that helps you to sit more erect. If you're sitting on by a computer table, try not to lean on the table. You don't want the light of the computer sort of disturbing you. In fact, you can close your eyes, but most people do to meditate. You don't need to look at me. Nothing's going to happen. It's all going to happen in your mind. So what you need to do is somehow turn inwards and just become aware of what's going on your mind. And you don't have to look at other people either, because they're going to be turning in their minds too. So sitting in a way that allows you to relax, particularly relaxing your shoulders. If you can place your hands on your lap somehow. If you're sitting on the floor, you don't need to sit on the floor to meditate. And most people usually find sitting on a chair more comfortable. There is a reason why people like to sit on the floor, but we'll talk about that some other time. So you could just sit and have a sense of being supported by the chair. And gradually turning inwards means like turning your senses inwards. That's why closing your eyes is useful, so that you're not being stimulated by visual images. And you can just be aware of your body on that, being supported on a chair, or if you're sitting on a stool or cushions. What's actually happening is you're sitting up whilst the force is pulling you down. We don't often think about this, but there's a force of gravity holding us down. And when we're standing up, we're kind of fighting with gravity. It's almost trying to knock us over and pull us down. So we're constantly rebalancing. But when we sit down, it's a lot easier to let go, as it were, into gravity or with gravity. And the chair, the earth beneath us, is supporting us. You can have a sense of just letting go. You're not really going to you really don't have to make much effort. In fact, the less effort you make, the better, really. Just being aware of any strong sensations you have in your body. There may be tension. If you're sitting cross-legged, you may have tension in your legs or your knees. And sometimes just paying attention to areas of tension or even pain helps to soften, to remove the tension. It allows us to let our mind settle a little more. It's a case of really moving our this ability we have of paying attention to different parts of our body, different experiences, just paying attention to your body and sensations in your body. And then becoming aware that you're breathing. And that could be because you can feel the air flowing in, flowing out. It may be because you can feel the body opening in the chest or in the belly, and then kind of closing slightly. There's an expansion and a retraction. And there's a rhythm to this, a rhythm to our breathing, which is very soothing. If we can find that rhythm of the in and the outflow, what we call breathing. Whole process, a whole mass of things happening as we breathe. And just exploring the experience of breathing. How do I know I'm breathing? The question you could ask yourself. What tells my brain that I'm breathing? What is the sensations? What are the sensations that are telling my brain that I'm breathing? What's interesting? Your mind goes to what's interesting. Is there anything at all interesting about breathing, about the way I'm breathing, or you're breathing? Or is there something uninteresting, which will actually is a trick to be interested, is to finding out what's, like, is breathing boring? Does it bore you to be aware of your breathing? Pay attention to your breathing. You don't need to really do anything to your breathing. You can let your breath just come and go. It's all being controlled by an autonomic system in your body. Sometimes we take a deeper breath or a shorter breath. So what is quite common is that we can maintain an interest in breathing for a certain amount of time. If we are particularly interested in breathing, we can maintain that time a lot longer. But after a while, it seems to normalize. And yes, we can feel the breath here, we can feel it there. Maybe, yes, I feel quite calm, feeling as though my breathing, paying attention to my breathing is making me feel a little calmer. And as it normalizes, usually what happens, we lose a little bit of interest in it. And we begin to find that our mind is more interested in something else. So it goes off somewhere, starts thinking. We'll be thinking about all sorts of things. Usually our thoughts are very repetitive. It's very rare that we have new thoughts. It's usually thoughts about something we thought about before many times. Might be a simple thing, like what am I going to have for breakfast, or lunch, or dinner? What's the weather like? Something will grab you, and it's good to realize that this thing that's grabbed you, you've considered to be more important than sitting here anchored to your breathing. You've just gone off, which is really interesting, isn't it? There you were, you're just going to be sitting here with your mind, with your breathing, paying attention to your breathing, and then you go off somewhere. We could get lost in thoughts quite easily at this point, and you're just sitting, thinking, what we often do when we're not doing anything else, which is start thinking about things. But very often we lose kind of a clear awareness, or we get lost in thoughts. We're not clear that we're actually thinking about something. So we could perhaps try to just be aware that when we start thinking about something, our mind has just started thinking about something. So another part of our awareness can watch this happening almost like a thought. You think of a thought as a thing. It comes into our mind, and we can think, oh, look, I'm thinking again. You don't give yourself a hard time for doing that. It's just really interesting. I'm starting to think. And maybe I could just try to come back to paying attention to my breathing. That's what I wanted to be anchored to. And let that thought go. You don't need to try to stop your thoughts because you'll just think about stopping thoughts. But you can allow your thoughts to just float off without trying to stop them, without trying to stop thoughts arising. If you're making any effort at all, it's just to remind yourself to come back, kind of be anchored in your experience of breathing. Maybe finding something of interest in that experience. There's so many sensations happening when you're breathing. And then, of course, you go off again. Another thought takes you away. Sometimes that thought leads to a subsequent thought, and then another thought, and another thought. Before you know what's happened, you're thinking about a whole mass of different things. For the purpose of this, if you like exercise, just allow yourself to come back to the sensation of breathing. So in this practice, let's just also pay attention to the experience of thinking, because it is very interesting that sometimes when our intention is to let the mind become still, maybe like the water on a pond, that's a pool of water where the water's still. We could look through it, could see the bottom of the pond. But more often than not, particularly if we're a bit agitated or restless, the water is kind of whipped up into waves, sort of short, choppy waves. And we're just kind of bouncing from one thought to another thought. Sometimes the waves are more like swells, so it's like a long thought, another long thought. It may be that if you've got up early or you're very tired, your mind may be a little bit sort of foggy, as though the water is full of plants, kind of something a bit sort of stuck. Sometimes it's even as though our minds are a bit kind of stained with a dye or covered in algae. And kind of where we feel just like, can't really make any effort, it's all just too much. Other times, our thoughts get caught up with something that's really strong, has an emotional, there's quite a lot of emotion invested in that thought, a bit pleasant or unpleasant. It's like really taking us away from allowing things to settle. So what sort of thoughts, what's your mind like at this moment in terms of these images? And by the way, your mind doesn't necessarily exist in your head. You may feel, you could imagine the mind existing more in the heart region, chest. And in the background, there's still this experience of the rhythm of breathing, this constant flow. Something begins and something ends. Something begins and something ends. And then it begins again. We could also reflect on the proposition, if you like, of what would it be like if my mind became still, like a pond, so that whatever I look at, whatever I'm tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, thinking, just kind of what has a stillness to it, a richness to it. I can be more absorbed in the sound. Look at the shapes, the colors as objects without having to tell a story, an explanation about them. What would it be like if I could still the mind, or just allow the mind to become still, as though the water becomes clear, the waves slow down, allowing any thoughts that arise just to flow through like a wave beneath us, might lift us up, begin to distract us from just letting go. If we let go, we just settle down. What would it be like if I could live my life like this? From a place of stillness, clarity, open-heartedness, when we feel more expansive, less tight. Allowing ourselves to be in a state of what you could call just being, without doing anything, without thinking about anything in particular. And then just lastly, we could just maybe rejoice in the fact we have a mind. We have this ability to pay attention. We can even be aware of ourselves being aware. Yes, aware that we are having a thought, it's having an effect on us. The kind of reflexive consciousness we have that can just be aware of what we're thinking, what we're experiencing. It's pretty amazing. And it may be frustrating if we feel as though there's very little control over that. Mind is rather unruly. But we may think of it more like a wild horse, full of energy, full of potential, power, strength, vitality. We may just consider that training a horse takes time, patience. It's a challenge. Life's full of challenges, and if we can rise to that challenge in a positive way, even if we've been sitting here just thinking about lots of different things, maybe we could rise to that challenge and think, oh, yeah, interesting to train my mind. It's like more control. I can let it become still, stiller. With a little bit of training. Maybe all sorts of new things will begin to emerge if the mind becomes still, quiet. And perhaps if nothing else has happened from this practice, we may have a sense that at least we've discovered more clearly from just observing that our mind is constantly changing. And this is, you could say, the nature of mind, or one of the aspects of the nature of mind, that it's not a fixed thing. It's more of a process of thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, coming and going, coming and going. So you can continue sitting being aware of your mind if you want to, if that's comfortable. It could also become more back to a normal awareness. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask me, can't guarantee I'll be able to give you an answer to all your questions, but do my best. And Nick will collect. You can put your questions in the chat box if you want to. You could also, probably that's the best place to put them, but if you're not comfortable with doing that, you could use the reaction button and put your hand up and you can ask the question. So we could do a few questions like that, and then Nick will collect technical support in London. This is title on the picture. He'll collect questions, and if he can gather them together as though there's a sort of, you might ask a question that represents several sort of interests that people have, Nick, if you can do that. If there are a lot of questions, I don't know how many questions are.
So Alex Greenwood is asking, how important is it to still the body?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? These volumes quite slow here.
So Alex Greenwood is asking, how important is it to still the body?
How important is it to still the body? Well, I guess there's a question behind this. There's another part of that question, because you could still the body because it's tired or all sorts of things. But to still the body in terms of helping your mind to become still, there's different ways of looking at that actually. Because if you've got a mind that's incredibly active or is really worried about things. I mean, if you've been watching the news and you feel that you just can't stop thinking about war or something else you've seen in the news, it may not be a very good thing to still the body, actually, to sit still. You may be better off doing something, because that will allow you to take control of your mind. But usually what happens in the process of working with your mind is that you allow the body to become still. You kind of close off your senses. All the time we're taking in information, we can't close our ears, so there'll always be sounds around. So we'll be taking information in. And it's part of our survival mechanism. We need to be on high alert all the time because something might threaten us. So we have that happening all the time. But the more we can just keep the body still, not having to move, not having to stand, not having to balance, that's quite a lot of things we don't have to do. And it makes it easier to then kind of focus much more on what's going on in the mind, to experience what the mind is. So it's the question can be answered in these different ways. So if you're meditating, usually sitting still is the best way. And you can, sometimes it's a bit of an effort to sit still, particularly if you've got some pain or it's uncomfortable. If you're very uncomfortable the way you're sitting, for instance, you can just move. I mean, there's no point in just forcing yourself to sit there, because all you'll be doing is thinking about, I can't move, I've got to sit still. And that would be probably tension creating. So when you're trying to work with your mind, usually it has two aspects. It's one of just calming the mind down, allowing yourself to calm down, your body to calm down, your thoughts to slow down, if you like. And then you can be much more observant to what's happening. And sometimes you just discover there are things going on under the surface which begin to evolve. So stillness is usually associated quite strongly with meditation, and images of the Buddha kind of give that message that stillness is important. But you can walk around meditating, you can walk around looking at things and being more aware of them. So there's no one answer, I guess, to being still. But usually starting off just doing nothing with your body is very helpful. Well, most of the time, actually, if you're meditating. I hope that answered the question. I don't know if that was quite what was being asked. Anything else?
So Vijaya Nandi says, after decades of meditation, I realized today that I find watching my breath really boring. Plus, I'm resistant to exploring that. Other meditation practices engage me much more. Any thoughts on how to best proceed?
Yeah, go to other meditation practices. Or if you wanted to be challenging, if you find that doing something is boring, then why is it boring? I mean, is watching your breath boring, or is it you who's just boring? Maybe you're just bored and you can't just watch your breath. Maybe that would be a challenging way of looking at it. And that would be interesting to do. That would be interesting to say, okay, I'm bored watching my breath. Let's experience what is this boredom that I'm feeling watching my breath. And if you're approaching meditation with the idea you're going to make something happen, well, that is another way of meditating. And what we're doing today is just sitting, trying to observe really what's happening. And the fact that you discover something is boring is really interesting, actually. I mean, Maitreya Bandhu talked about this when he was meditating, leading meditations 4 weeks ago. And it is the more you can go into your boredom, the less boring it is, actually. Because actually boredom itself, we can often get bored about all sorts of things, and we don't often know how to deal with boredom. And usually how we deal with boredom is to distract ourselves. So we think, oh, I'm bored, I'll do something. But supposing we thought, oh, I'm a human being that's bored, so why am I bored? Why can't I just sit being aware of being alive? I'm just breathing. That's what I do. I'm breathing. I'm a human being that's breathing. It's happening all the time. And you could approach things that way. If you know that thinking about something in particular, visualizing something in particular kind of quietens your mind down, well, there's no reason not. It's a good reason to do it. Just calm your mind down that way. So, but yeah, a lot of people find it's very, very common when people meditate and they're taught to be aware of their breathing. It's so often you find it boring, and the very fact that whenever your mind goes off somewhere, it's usually because that's more interesting than than breathing. Breathing's really not very interesting unless you start exploring breathing. How do you know you're breathing? Where do you breathe? What's moving when you're breathing? You have all these different diaphragms in your body that are moving around, and is being aware of of your breath calming, or is it stimulating? All sorts of things you could refocus on when you're being aware of your breathing. If you're just sitting there going, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, it's going to be boring. But it actually, if you're sitting there and you're breathing in and breathing out, and you think, oh, this is very calming. This is having quite a pleasant experience of it. That will bring a lot of interest to it. So you can just not focus on breathing, or you could turn the whole experience of being bored with breathing into something interesting. And I say this in a way as a way of approaching life, because you can do this with everything in life. Everything in life that's boring, you can, when you're bored, which you will be at times, or some people are never bored because they're always doing things, very active people, but maybe very active people need to be a bit more bored sometimes. You need to learn how to just hang out and do nothing. So I think you should give boring, the experience of boredom, you should give it a sort of, raise it up to a higher level. It's a higher level of practice. But boredom is an interesting thing. Okay, maybe enough on boredom.
And so Roland is asking, When change can be so freeing, why don't we want to see it?
Well, I suppose this comes down to an aspect of being is about ourselves, that we kind of naturally tend to think that we exist as a kind of fixed entity. And can you just ask the question again? I have a mind that constantly segues off into things. I have to make
So,
sure I stick on the subject.
so when change can be so freeing,
Yeah.
why don't we want to see it?
Okay, so there's probably a certain amount of fear then in that question, that we don't want to see it, we don't want to see change, and that is because we have to come to terms with the fact that everything's changing. Like, we're all getting older. Every single moment we're getting older. Every single moment we're getting closer to death. That is something we don't want to accept, and we don't like change, and we want things to be, if we can fix something. Even I was thinking over the weekend, there's this saying, there's one thing you can be certain of, and that is you're going to die. I'm not actually sure that you can be certain you're going to die. I mean, I think you can be pretty sure your body's going to fail, and the body will stop working. But to say it's going to be death means that you're going to be experiencing it, which means you're kind of not dying. I don't know if you can see what I mean, but I think why we don't like change is because we're really trying to feel confident in ourselves as being a human being. And it's not easy to reframe that and think of ourselves as a constantly ever-changing, a marvelously beautiful, ever-changing process of being, and enjoying change when they happen. Our tendency in life is to hold on to things, because when we hold on to things, it gives us a sense of our own identity. But as things change and we adjust to them, everything kind of moves and goes out of kilter, and it can be exhausting as well. We're constantly responding to things changing. But that's life, isn't it? The weather's never the same. It's sunny some days, it's raining other days. When you want it to be this way, it goes that way. And if we, it's a bit like if you're driving a car, you're constantly moving the car, aren't you? First you drive, you're constantly turning the wheel, speeding up, slowing down, because everything's changing around you. And if you can go through life accepting that's how you're going to live your life, instead of wanting to park the car and just sit there, it kind of makes it all more interesting, really. And so I guess there's a certain fear in change, and a discomfort. It causes quite a lot of suffering, really, because things are so many things are outside of our control. In fact, the only thing you can really control is what's going on in your mind, and that's really hard to do as well.
So Amy is saying, my mind is often going over plans and scheming when I meditate. I try to label my experience, but perhaps what I really need is to plan better outside of meditation. Any tips?
Yeah, Amy, my mind does that as well. And I'm sitting here meditating, I'm thinking about the next thing I'm going to say, so I'm kind of scheming and planning. It's just so normal. But if you find it, yeah, if you wanted to, probably maybe all of us need to do this, is to give ourselves time to think about things. A lot of people take up meditation to quieten their mind, to become calm. And what they end up doing is planning and thinking about things, or dealing with anxieties and fears and so on. And in a way, that's what they're using their time for. But you could see meditation more as a kind of training. It's a bit like going to the gym. you're going to the gym to exercise the body. Well, if you think of meditation more as a kind of training of the mind, so that when you're doing meditation, that's what you're doing, is training the mind. And you're not planning, you may have to come to terms with the fact that that's what you keep doing, keep planning, but you're training yourself to get away from habitually doing that thing. But you probably do need to plan and work out what you're going to do. That might be your personality type. Some people just are able to not plan and just deal with things as they arise. But they'll have other issues they have to deal with. But so many people nowadays do almost never sit down and just do nothing. Usually people feel guilty doing nothing. They feel like it's wrong to sit and do nothing. To sit just and look out the window and just let your mind wander, let your mind plan. You might actually have a piece of paper while you're planning and write down, well, that was a good plan. I'll write that down. You kind of make some progress with the planning. But if you're not doing the things that you really want to do and need to do, and the only time you've got in your day to do them is when you're meditating, that's what will happen. It's just normal. And it's probably, the whole nature of Mind Project will be a training in trying to help you to discover what you're doing with your mind all the time, not just when you're meditating. And but you will need to sometimes stop doing things, because when you're fully occupied with something, your mind's functioning in a very focused and in a very directed way. And so it's not easy to actually be aware of what's going on in the mind and having control of it. So that's usually the best answer, is to, it's bad news for a lot of people, find more time. So it's like prioritize. What finding more time means, like reprioritize your activities. And you can do this even like you discover that you can make time when you're walking from one place to another. You can actually start planning. You think, oh, I'm going to plan myself and I walk to the bus stop or to the shops or something, if that's what you want to do. If you want to feel anxious, or you can't help feeling anxious, you could give yourself time to feel worried and anxious. That's just part of your being, is kind of throwing that up, so you can give yourself time to do that. And then you just there's spaciousness. Of course, that's not easy in this modern world. We have so much to do, and you have in a way you have to learn to be more and more creative with your life and just take control of it a bit more, I suppose, and try to recognize you have some control, even in small ways, just a few moments here and there of doing nothing. See what happens. Good luck.
There's one here that says, how does a person who really understands that everything is always changing behave differently to someone who doesn't? What qualities do you gain from integrating that understanding?
I think when you come to terms with the fact that everything's changing, you can also become a little bit more aware that you're the author of change, that you can actually change things in a way that is more helpful to you. Certain things happen to you. Let's say you're given some bad news, or let's say you look at the news and it upsets you. Okay, so you've got, first of all, you've got the upset, the grief of what you're seeing and hearing to deal with. And you need to give yourself time to deal with that. But then what you may do is you might start ruminating, kind of going back over and over and over again, thinking about that thing, and it's kind of taking you over. You kind of lost control of it. So can you remind me what the question was again? Because I can find my mind segueing off into something else.
Yeah, so it's how does a person who really understands that everything's changing behave differently to someone who doesn't, and what qualities do you gain from integrating that?
Well, yeah, drawing myself back a bit, really. I think actually it's a question of, are you really aware of things changing? I mean, basically, you don't need to think about things being changing all the time. You just start noticing things are changing. And I think the great thing about knowing things are changing, when you feel stuck in a particular state, like I was talking about boredom before, you know that boredom won't be there forever. When you're stuck in a state of anxiety, you know that you won't have to be in that state of anxiety forever. You know things change, so that you can actually you can have a more sort of optimistic view of life. I reckon if you know that things change, if you're not going to be sort of so stuck with things. If you're just not aware that things are changing all the time, usually what people do, not everyone, but it'd be quite normal, is you're trying to fix things. You're trying to get the building blocks of your life in place and keep them there, if you see what I mean. Like you build your life up out of different aspects, different compartments, your job, your family, where you live and everything. You try and get all these things in lines so that they stay where they are. But life doesn't allow it to stay there like in that line for very long. Things get moved. And if you don't accept that, what happens is you cause yourself a lot of grief and a lot of suffering. And you just, why does it go wrong all the time? Why can't it just be still? Why can't I just have it like I want it? And it's just so frustrating. But when you think, oh, this is life, it's just gone wrong again, and I'll put it back into place and just carry on in that way, you can have a much richer, full of life, I think. And you can actually use change to your own benefit. You think, well, I think I'm a bit stuck. I'm sort of have a very positive self-view. Well, you can change that if everything changes. You don't have to go on thinking in that way. You could change the way you are. It's not easy. We have a habit of being who we are, but we can change who we are. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities, isn't it? So it allows us to be so much more creative in life. Right, one more question.
So that's it for questions, but there's lots of thank yous and appreciation coming through.
So I'd just like to say one last thing, is that the project, this Nature of Mind project, is something that has been started up initially by Maitra Bandhu and Monavacha, and we're trying to make this available to as many people as possible. And in order to do this, I mean, I'm in a studio here with all special equipment at Adhisthana, and Nick, the technical support's in London, who's employed to help make this whole project work seamlessly, and working on bringing more and more people in, more experts into the whole project to give it freely to as many people as possible. But we are looking for supporters to help us do that. And this kind of support we're looking for is if people could consider making a donation of ideally something like £50 for this 6-month project that is going to be available online even after it finishes for a long time. But to make this whole thing happen, and then even better still, to be able to repeat it in the future, we're looking for support. So one of the things you could consider is, to do with change. You could change your bank account slightly. I mean, after all, it's just numbers in your bank account. It's not real money, it's just numbers. You can move some of the numbers into another place, and that's change. You're going with change, and that would be wonderful to support that. And the other thing you can notice about making donations and supporting things it actually changes how you are and how you feel, that you feel more expansive, and usually you feel happier when you give things. So just like to invite you to really partake in this project, not just by being a recipient, but actually by actively supporting us to continue this project into the future. And so I think we got a link somewhere where people could go and grab the moment. If you feel like giving something now, just go and do it, because your mind will change. And later on in the day, you'll forget, or you think, oh, I don't know about that, I might spend it on something else. But, just at the moment, just learn to grab the day and up a day, just make something happen, positive, and see how it affects you. So maybe on that, I'll have to close there. And, well, we've just got a few more minutes, but I think you could maybe, we're all in a community at the moment. There's still 70 of us on this platform. You could all unmute yourself if you wanted to and just say goodbye to whoever, and just to give you a sense of all being in this big community, which we hope will grow and grow to thousands of people.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Sona.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sona.
Bye.
Bye.
you.
Bye.
See you tomorrow.
Sona.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Pleasure. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.